Hello and warm welcome from Washington, D.C. I'm Ismail Jalilov for Straight Talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I would posit that today we live in the world of narratives. Those narratives are quite often mutually exclusive. And we're confronted by the choice we have to make, we're compelled to make, which one of these narratives to believe. We're conditioned to think that there are two sides of every story. And which story we believe probably is dictated by what we want to believe, what other people would call cognitive dissonance. Although I will posit there's only one side to every story, and the other side of the story is a lie, plain and simple. So if the story is told right, it's easy for people to make the decision as to which narrative is more believable and which narrative is just spin. On this channel, we try to tell the story. We try to tell the truth with the meager capabilities and funding that we have. It's not about funding, it's about approaching the work you do with, utmost conscience. People always accuse people of things. On this channel, we don't have national allegiances. We don't have ethnic allegiances. I'm Azerbaijani, I'm also American. Fairness and truth are the most important things for me, and they have been throughout my life. That is why I am where I am. That is why I left my country. Because as a journalist, at some point in its history, I could not do my job. I am doing my job here in Washington. And there is no other guiding principle than to tell you, my audience, the truth. Even if 3 people are watching me, even if 1 person is watching me, I owe you just one thing, not a narrative, not a beautiful story that I want to believe, not a story that will demonize someone and sanctify someone else. I owe you just one thing, the truth. And I'm sorry for this emotional appeal. I am dealing with a lot of stuff on Twitter. I am accused by one party of the conflict of being unfair and untrustworthy, which is fine. Trust is in the eye of the beholder. Today we invited a guest to tell you the story that we want to tell you. What he will tell you, I have no idea. But from what I understand, he has seen things that we have not seen from here. Taras Kuzio is with us. Hi, Taras, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon or good morning in Washington.
Good morning. Taras, you have visited the Lachin Road. I've seen your posts online, and I'll be showing them during the interview from time to time. Would you please tell me when you were there, when you were witnessing, what sort of events and what time frame were you there?
It was about 2 to 3 weeks ago, end of January. I flew to Baku and did the very long drive journey of about 5-6 hours from Baku to Lachin and to Susha. There on the mountains, of course, you're in wintry conditions. In Baku, very different weather. But a hive of activity there, fascinating, because there are different, obviously, aspects to what's going on there. And I was always a bit uncomfortable being so close to Russian soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Were you afraid for your life while you were there? Uncomfortable being close to Russian soldiers, I totally understand that. There is a picture that actually shows how uncomfortable you are. What were you uncomfortable about? Were you expecting them to start shooting at any time or attacking people? What was the source of your discomfort?
When you talk to people there, they said things have quietened down. It's not as tense now as it was at the beginning when the protests began. And the reason for that, I am assuming, is that these Russian so-called, we should always say so-called peacekeeping forces, did not know how to react to these protests. I mean, they're not proper trained peacekeeping forces. And therefore they came right up very close, face to face with the protesters.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a potential threat of some kind of violence. I guess that's the reason why the Azerbaijani authorities then brought in their own troops, special forces, who are guarding the perimeter on the Azerbaijani side of the Lachin Road in case of anything happening. But now the Russian so-called peacekeepers keep their distance from the protesters. So there's some kind of, as it were, modus vivendi between them.
During the World Championship, Football World Championship, Soccer World Cup, as they call it here in America, there was a point where the Russian peacekeepers, I saw it on the videos posted, were standing mere meters away, maybe 2 meters, maybe 3 meters tops, from the Azerbaijani protesters and watching the World Cup together with them on the big screen that they had installed on the Azerbaijani side. Was there any unease at any point? Did you feel that the two armies, two troops, can come in contact with each other, like in military contact with each other, start shooting?
Because not really, because there's a fence between them. I mean, it's difficult to show it, but the road, the Lachin Road, is where the peacekeepers are, below the protesters and behind the protesters, and they kind of move up and down during the course of the day. Then there's a border fence, which I guess is the territory controlled by Azerbaijan, the road going up to Shusha and going down to Baku. And on that side of the fence are the Azerbaijani special forces. So I think that there would only be some kind of clash if, for example, something happened between Russian troops and the protesters. But that, I think, the original initial phase of tension is now being kind of sorted out and resolved.
All right. I would like to apologize to my guest and to the audience. Due to technical glitch, we have seen the wrong Chiron under his name. I would like to make a proper introduction. Taras Kuzio is professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and he's an expert on politics, crime, and security in Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And again, once again, my apologies. Taras, since we've already started with this tweet, I would like to continue with it. I am showing your tweet the response to Samantha Power, the head of the USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, in which she says, let me read this tweet to the audience. Oops, if I could do it right. Transportation through the Lachin corridor has been blocked for over a month. Each day, commercial traffic and humanitarian assistance cannot flow freely to Nagorno-Karabakh. The potential for a humanitarian crisis increases. Free movement through the corridor must be restored. That's a tweet from Samantha Power, to which you responded, just visited the Lachin Road, and this is not true. Please ask U.S. intelligence agencies to do homework. Humanitarian aid and so-called Russian peacekeepers, in quotation marks, allowed through, U.S. be better served pressuring Armenia to implement the November 20 ceasefire agreement and sign a peace treaty. Taras, basically this is self-explanatory. The United States, through Samantha Power, who used to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations at the time, is saying that there is a blockade, that the U.S. assistance cannot flow freely, and there is a potential for a humanitarian crisis. Funny enough, interestingly enough, one Azerbaijani non-governmental employee who was on my program also said that Karabakh is on the precipice of a humanitarian crisis because of the protests ongoing. What do you think of the protests? Why do you not agree that the blockade is not there? And why do you not agree that there is a humanitarian catastrophe on the loom in Karabakh? Could you please explain that?
Well, there's a number of reasons. We have to put it into context of other so-called frozen conflicts in Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Frozen conflict areas are, by their nature, big, black, corrupt holes. There's always going to be criminality, huge shadow economy, organized crime, smuggling operations, you name it. This is how these frozen conflict territories Transnistria, Moldova, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Georgia, and Karabakh under Armenian occupation for nearly 30 years. That's how they operated financially. And so those routes, smuggling routes and illegal contraband type of activities have been ended by this protest. But I don't think that, and there's no evidence from what I saw that actual movements by A, Russian peacekeepers, and B, by the International Red Cross, they're not being blocked when those Russian so-called peacekeeping forces and the International Red Cross vehicles, when they come through that Lachin corridor place where the protests are happening, the protesters move out of the way and they go through. So I saw that with my own eyes. I think the problem that you have is that the ambassador and others, they get their information from biased sources, whether it's from the media or they get it from the Armenian diaspora. They don't, I mean, I never saw any American diplomats on the ground there. So how do they know that this is a blockade that's causing a humanitarian crisis? And as I wrote in my tweet, there would be no protests if after 2 years Armenia sat properly at the table and agreed to negotiate a post-conflict, post-war peace treaty. I mean, this is the crux of the problem, not the protest. So I think the ambassador is focusing on the wrong issue. The real issue, which would mean both Azerbaijan and Armenia moving forward, and Karabakh would no longer be this black hole of criminality, would be that both countries signed a peace agreement, the border is recognized, and by the border I mean the former Soviet Republican boundary between the Soviet republics of Azerbaijan and Armenia. That would have to be whereby Armenia would recognize Karabakh as being part of Azerbaijan. We understand there should be some formulation of minority rights, guarantee of minority rights, but the crux of the problem aren't the protests. This is just a side issue that Armenia has jumped upon. The real issue is that Yerevan has been dragging its heels in signing this peace agreement and recognizing the border, and it's been dragging its heels because of Russian pressure. Russia is not interested in any peace agreement, any peace outcome, because Russia always wants conflicts to remain frozen. The longer the conflicts are frozen, the longer the so-called peacekeepers are there. If the conflict's over, because the peace treaty is signed, peacekeepers have to go home. Russia doesn't want that.
Is this sort of logic basically a binary, choice? Conflict, Russia is there. Conflict is gone, Russia is gone. Is this pretty clear all over the region and all over the world, do you think? Do people understand? Do people looking at this conflict from here, from the West? I say here, although you're in England and I'm in the United States, but I mean the West. Do people understand that? And
yes,
do you? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, to a great degree, because we have to try to understand Russian national identity. Russian national identity, as always, not only under Vladimir Putin, even under Boris Yeltsin, the so-called democratic Russian leader, even under him, Russia always demanded that its exclusive sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union be recognized by the West. Russia always demanded this exclusive sphere of influence. And it uses frozen conflicts, which often it itself manufactures artificially, to maintain that sphere of influence. You know, the most crucial thing for Russia in Karabakh is that Russian flag is flying and Russian troops are there. Those Russian troops have no interest in peacekeeping. They're not even probably trained for peacekeeping. But the same thing happened in Moldova, in Transnistria region in the early 90s, in Georgia's Abkhazia and South Ossetia. and in Karabakh. There's no difference. The only difference was that a slight difference was that in some cases Russian troops directly intervened, such as in Moldova, whereas in Georgia and in Azerbaijan, Russia used proxy forces, whether it's Chechens, others, or Armenians in the case of Azerbaijan. But it's the same issue, is that Russia is not interested in the frozen conflicts being resolved. What if they're resolved? Russia will go home. Russian peacekeepers will go home, and Russia doesn't want that. So yes, it's the same problem throughout the region.
Taras, then if it is the same problem throughout the region as we talk about, and you're preaching to the choir here, but my opinion does not really matter. If we look at Transnistria, if we look at Abkhazia, if we look at the two illegal entities in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea and Karabakh, why is reaction from the West always has been the same? As far as I have observed, maybe, again, I am not seeing things, but the reaction I've observed is Transnistria is unequivocally Moldovan, Ukraine is indivisible, Abkhazia is part of Georgia, Karabakh is a totally separate issue. What is the logic that separates Karabakh from all other Russian-manufactured, as you suggest, conflicts all over the Russian, borders?
Well, I think that one of the major factors differentiating them is that in Moldova and Georgia, there wasn't as much bloodshed and ethnic cleansing as there was in the Armenian-Azerbaijan war of the late 1980s, early 1990s. So that makes it different in that sense. But we also have the problem that of all these ethnic groups, Georgians, Abkhaz, Ossetians, Moldovans, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis, only Armenians have larger diaspora. Azerbaijanis don't, Georgians don't, Moldovans don't. So that also means that Armenians can press their case to a far greater degree than, say, the Georgians or Azerbaijanis or Moldovans can. And the Armenian diaspora is particularly large in the United States and in France. And both of those countries were members of the Minsk group that was created by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to try to find a peaceful resolution of the conflict going back to this was formed in, I think, 1996. So France and the United States, together with Russia, were the three main powers involved in the Minsk group attempt to get peace. Two of those have huge Armenian minority and very successful lobby groups. To give you a comparison, the largest Ukrainian diaspora group in Western Europe was always in Britain, where I grew up, with about 30,000 Ukrainians. In France, there's something like 800,000 Armenians. So this is a huge. What this has meant is that countries like France have been totally biased on the Armenian question, and without any, there's simply no way you can deny that. Both houses of the French Parliament 2 years ago voted in favor of the Armenian position on Karabakh. President Macron has always adopted a pro-Armenian position, to the extent to which Azerbaijan has refused to allow France to become involved in peace talks anymore because it's so biased. The USA, I think, is a more complicated case. I think it's a mixture of both the large Armenian lobby in the United States, plus I think very difficult and complicated relations between the United States and Turkey. And it didn't help when one of the first things President Biden did was to recognize 1915 as a genocide committed by Turkey. I mean,
I apologize, Taras. I apologize. Biden's mentioning genocide and de facto admitting genocide also came with the caveat that the modern day Turkey is in no way responsible or will
Right.
not be held responsible. Do you think that understanding permeates the region? Do you think that
No,
people in
no,
Armenia hear that? Okay.
no, they don't, and I think it's a very important point, because there were two Turkish journalists from Turkish CNN at the Lachin corridor as well, and we discussed this. Um, to give you a comparison, Turkey and Azerbaijan talk about each other as one nation, two countries, one people. And I asked Azerbaijanis and these Turkish journalists, does that mean to say that the Turks, who are a huge country, 80 million compared to 10 million Azerbaijanis, do they kind of have a paternalistic and arrogant view of Azerbaijanis? And they said, no, nobody senses that. And I said, well, the reason for that is obvious. It's because Turkey's been a post-imperial nation state for 100 years. And so that kind of imperial arrogance has gone out of the Turkish identity. In the Russian case, it's still there because Russians also claim Ukraine and Russia are one people, but this is done from a purely chauvinistic, arrogant denial of anything Ukrainian. So I think that this is an important point that the Turkey since Kemal Atatürk of the 1920s is a different country. It's a nation state. It's not the Turkey of the Ottoman Empire when these horrible crimes were committed in 1915. So I think that is an important point, but I think it's not picked up by anybody. One of the strangest things, by the way, about these diasporas is that although they live in the West, in France and the United States, they're all pro-Russian, these Armenian diasporas. And I
Why
guess
would you say that? I'm kind of curious as to what makes you think they're pro-Russian.
because their anti-Turkishness makes them into being pro-Russian. They see from a geopolitical point of view, that's how they see it, that the only way for Armenia to survive is by having a strong bilateral security relationship with Russia, because they don't trust either Turkey or Azerbaijan. Now, probably the reason for that is that most of the Armenians living in the United States, maybe in France as well, come from what is now Eastern Turkey.
Mhm.
And so it's very sad for Armenia in the sense that Armenia today is like Belarus. There are only two countries in the former Soviet Union who have become Russian puppet states, and it's Armenia and Belarus. Belarus, we understand why, with Lukashenko, but Armenia has a democratically elected prime minister, Nikol Pashinyan, and Armenia would be a lot better served, and the Armenian people would be a lot better served if they adopted a more balanced foreign policy as opposed to just completely tying themselves to Russia.
Taras, I understand that neither you nor I are experts on diaspora, but as an observer, I am kind of curious. You brought up diaspora. I wasn't going to touch that. But since we're talking about the diaspora, do you think there is a lot of effort here in the United States, or as it may be in France, with which I'm not at all familiar, to downplay Armenia's special relationship with Russia? Because every tweet that I see from one of the main lobbying groups of Armenians in America, ANCA, the Armenian National Congress of America, emphasizes that Armenia is a Christian nation stuck between two Turkic nations that are hell-bent on destroying it. But it's never mentioned that Russia is Armenia's military ally, that Russia is the largest by far contributor to the Armenian economy, and the second friendly nation in the region to Armenia is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which also blows up the entire narrative of the Christian versus Muslim conflict. So is there an effort, a concerted effort to downplay or hide, conceal Armenia's special relationship with Russia in the diaspora? And by extension, I'm sorry I'm asking a long question, but by extension, does it mean that the work of the diaspora quite often undermines the nations, host nations, foreign policy goals. I can look at the United States and its policy goals in the region and surmise that the anti-Azerbaijani hysteria here in Washington makes Azerbaijanis mistrust the United States, distrust the United States, not perceive it as a fair mediator, and basically impedes the U.S. foreign policy goals in the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's obvious that they don't want to touch this question, Armenian diaspora representatives, because whenever I bring it up on Twitter, nobody tries to hound me for it. Nobody tries to debate it with me. They just don't want to touch it. And it's a fact. You can't escape it. Armenia was a founding member of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, formed in the early 1990s by Russia as a kind of a Russian counterweight to NATO. When the CSTO intervened in Kazakhstan a year ago to suppress popular protests, Armenian forces were part of that CSTO invading force, intervening force. In 2013, both Ukraine and Armenia were both about on the verge of signing association agreements with the European Union, what was what's called under the terms of the Eastern Partnership. Armenia pulled out under heavy Russian pressure and instead joined the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Vladimir Putin's alternative to the European Union. Russians tried to pressure Ukraine to pull out as well, and this led to the Euromaidan revolution and Yanukovych's overthrow, because he went ahead with those Russian pressures and lobbying. But Ukraine stayed in the European Union Association Agreement. Armenia pulled out and joined the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. So Armenia is a member of the two main structures led by Russia: economic, social, and also military security. Also, the other interesting factor is that in the former Soviet Union, most countries since the invasion of Ukraine have basically distanced themselves from Russia. For example, Kazakhstan and Central Asian countries. Armenia has not. So there are only really two countries in the former Soviet Union that are now Russian allies and Russian puppet states. And these are Belarus and Armenia. And it's not just that Russia has and Armenia have close economic ties. Russia controls the Armenian economy. Russia controls the Armenian energy sector. Russia controls Armenian nuclear power plant. So
sorry, does that become a factor in the way the West perceives Armenia? Because the efforts to sort of claw back Armenia continue. Does the West understand what a daunting task it's going to be?
Well, I think it is going to be a daunting task. I think these factors are always ignored. I think I would call it Islamophobia, that Armenia is very successful in promoting itself as this, an embattered Christian small country caught between these rivals. You'd be surprised how many people are completely shocked when you tell them that actually in the early 1990s, when the first Karabakh War was taking place, that most of the crimes were committed by Armenia against Azerbaijan. They have this, I think, biased viewpoint that, oh, no, most of the crimes must have been committed by the Islamic side, not the Christian side. That's not true in the early 1990s, but that's a commonly held perception amongst even people I would call to be experts on the region. I think that for Armenia, the path forward has to be signing a peace treaty with Azerbaijan and moving towards reviving its links with the European Union, maybe signing an association agreement. Going back to 2013, I think Nikol Pashinyan is probably at heart closer to Europe than he is to Russia. He came to power in the color revolution, after all. And Putin will always distrust Pashinyan because he came to power in the revolution. So I think that's the path. But Armenia cannot move forward until that peace treaty is signed. The tragedy of Armenia is that it's tied itself to Russia, which does no good for the Armenian economy. There are more Armenians. There are practically as many Armenians living in Russia today as there are in Armenia.
I apologize for interrupting you earlier because I did ask a very loaded and long, not loaded, but long question, loaded with facts. Can we go back to it for a second? You mentioned that Azerbaijan precluded France from basically continuing to engage in peacekeeping force, mediation, peace mediation, because of the perceived unfairness by France dictated by the Armenian lobby. Is that true of the United States, do you think? Does the United States approximate that line where people in Azerbaijan mistrusted to the extent that, even American mediation effort is going to be viewed as tainted?
I think the viewpoint towards America is more mixed. It is rather bizarre that the only country in the former Soviet Union which the United States applied sanctions to was to Azerbaijan in the 1990s, even though it was Azerbaijani territory that was occupied, not Armenian territory occupied. And those sanctions, which are lifted every year on the presidential prerogative, are still there in American legislation. So I think there's suspicion towards the United States, but the reality is, I think Azerbaijan would be very happy to have the United States take a more active profile in the South Caucasus because it is the predominant NATO power. And as you've mentioned, Iran is a major factor. I think for Azerbaijanis, the biggest threat to their security comes from Iran. And in the event of, potential conflicts arising in the area, for example, some conflict between Israel and Iran, it's not out of the question that Azerbaijan could potentially launch some military activities against Azerbaijan. During the Second Karabakh War, in the fall of 2020, Iranian troops crossed the border into Azerbaijan as a way of helping Armenian forces retreat, as it were. So I think the Iranian threat is there, and you're absolutely right. It's a bizarre relationship that Armenia, a democratic country with a democratically elected leadership, its two main geopolitical allies are Russia and Iran, the two most sanctioned countries in the world, with two horrible dictatorships. And so Armenia should be looking elsewhere for friends.
This question has been bothering me for a while now. We always talk about the Russian Federation seeking to freeze these conflicts that arguably it has helped create or directly created alongside its borders. But the question gnawing at me is Russia alone in this? Is Russia the only power that is interested in freezing this conflict? Would that also not be what other powers want? Because, dealing with this conflict right now is, against the backdrop of what's going on in Ukraine, is neither expedient nor convenient, nor easy. It's never been easy, but on top of that, what's compounding the problem is the war against Ukraine. Do you think that the other powers, other than Russia, would also want to sweep it under the carpet and deal with a more important conflict at hand?
Well, the frozen conflicts in all three countries, Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, have been around since the early 1990s. In all three cases, the West never seriously tried to resolve them. It basically gave up on them and allowed Russia or its proxy state, in this case Armenia, to occupy these territories. I mean, the West never pushed back against Russian occupation of Transnistria, Moldova, or Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And I think and this has led tragically to a more pro-Russian government in Georgia, which is moving away from its association agreement with the European Union, and this led to, I think, quite biased viewpoints about what was taking place in the occupied areas of Azerbaijan. It was as though Azerbaijan was prosecuted, was criticized for having its own country occupied. It was never Armenia. I think that things will now begin to change precisely because of what you've talked about, because of the war in Ukraine. Because now we have a situation where the West can no longer be so hypocritical about these questions. Because all of the things that the West is condemning in Ukraine took place previously in occupied areas of Azerbaijan. So, for example, destruction of cultural and religious areas and buildings, war crimes, deforestation, mining, and killing of civilians. All of these things have taken place in Armenian occupied areas of Azerbaijan, were ignored by the West. Now Azerbaijan is taking Armenia to international courts about these questions and asking for huge amounts of financial compensation. At the same time as the West is doing this for Ukraine. So you can't have hypocrisy here. If the West is supporting, for example, that $300 billion frozen from the Russian government in Western banks and should be transferred to Ukraine to pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine destroyed by Russia, then what about the costs for rebuilding the 7 provinces which are occupied by Armenia for nearly 30 years, where literally everything has been destroyed? And I've been to those territories. Everything has been destroyed and stolen. The stories you heard were Iranian construction companies coming there and buying up doors, windows, bricks, stones, you name it, buying them up. So everything was destroyed. Who's going to pay for all this? If the Russians are being forced to pay for it in Ukraine, well, this is a question now being put forward by Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan is now using the case of Ukraine to push its own claims forward, and I think that will prove challenging for Western countries. Yes, it will change the narrative, right? It will change. This is completely change the narrative.
Speaking of narratives, Taras, I'm very curious. Is it hard to be presenting the truth of the conflict and sort of deviating from the orthodoxy, which I have come to perceive, maybe completely wrongly, as pro-Armenian? Do you agree that the predominant narrative of this
Yes.
conflict is okay?
Without a question. I mean, I know this even from so-called objective and think tank or academic publications, where people are stunned to hear. They're stunned to hear that most of the crimes committed in the First Karabakh War were committed by the Armenian side, not the Azerbaijani side. I think it's an ingrained viewpoint that that Islamic groups or people of Islamic nations are going to be more violent than these lovely Christian Armenians. I mean, this is I've had to show them evidence and say, look, yes, the Azerbaijani side did some unpleasant things as well in the early 90s, but the figures speak for themselves. 200,000 Armenians who fled from Azerbaijan, but 750,000 Azerbaijanis who were expelled from the occupied territories. That's already 3 times more, plus 200,000 from Armenia itself. So that's a million compared to 200,000. And when you say these kinds of facts, you'd be surprised that the eyes open really wide and they go, "What? Is that really true?" And I'll give you one example, one concrete example on this. In September of last year, I published an article in Rolling Stone magazine about the 4,000 Azerbaijani prisoners of war and civilians who went missing and are presumed killed in about 1994. And some of their bodies are now being recovered. This is like a taboo subject for Armenians. They don't want to talk about these missing people. This is the first time in the history of Rolling Stone magazine where they didn't put that issue with my article online because they got flooded with letters threatening the editorial staff.
Right, and that is what fascinates me. Why journalists who brag about their independence, who cherish their independence, journalistic independence, people who are decent in doing their work decently, why do they balk when they receive these mass threats from the Armenian lobby? What gives?
I don't know. It's I mean, take a look. Your listeners can take a look. Rolling Stone magazine. Every issue is online except September of last year. And that's only because of my article about the 4,000 missing Azerbaijani civilians and prisoners of war. So I really don't have an answer. I think it's cowardice on the part of Rolling Stone magazine that they did that. Because
did they issue a retraction? Did they?
No. They didn't. They didn't do anything. I mean, they didn't explain why that issue is not online. And I have access to university library accounts, so it wasn't online there either. So
did you ask Rolling Stone as to why?
They didn't. They did admit that they got a lot of angry and threatening letters, but the irony is none of those letters that they got from the Armenian diaspora ever questioned the article, because they don't want to touch this issue, because it would open a Pandora's box. But what they talked about more was this, this is just propaganda. We are a suffering people, Christian nation. We're threatened by, the usual things. And of course, they always bring up 1915 and everything else. But the actual topic of the article, they don't want to talk about.
Were you physically threatened? Did you receive any hate mail or threats against your person?
Well, sure, I get stupid comments occasionally on primarily on Twitter, which is the main social media I use. But I can ignore them, but not as many as I would be surprised about. Because as I said, going back to the question of Armenia being totally in Russia's pocket, they can't question that. I'm not making things up when I write about crimes that took place in the 1990s. The reality is both sides committed crimes, but most of the highest number of crimes are committed by Armenia. And that's what we should be looking at. And Azerbaijan is now in a more favorable position, both because economically and energy-wise. Europe wants all of Azerbaijan's energy output, because it no longer is taking in Russian energy, and also because the precedent of what the West is supporting in Ukraine now, so it can't deny that to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's also in a more favorable position because it now has a strong ally, Turkey. Remember, up until 10 years ago, Azerbaijan was alone. It didn't have any allies. So now it does.
Taras, I'm kind of curious, and I'm sorry I'm spending too much time on this topic, but when it comes to physical threats, when it comes to insults and abusive behavior online, I'm also on Twitter. That's where I met you virtually. I'm new to Twitter, and I'm trying to learn ins and outs of the platform, and I understand this is a platform that rewards conflict and intransigence. I get that. But I'm kind of curious as to, the behavior of Western journalists and the behavior of Western institutions, be it academia, be it large media organizations. it feels like an organized campaign of hounding and attacks. Hounding is the word that you used. Sort of pays off. Groups that engage in that always get away and get to their goal. I am kind of curious. Why is it okay for the Armenian diaspora to engage in that behavior, in such behavior online? I am called anything from Leni Riefenstahl to the Azerbaijani regime to genocide enabler. I mean, and this is, for a person with my level of consciousness and conscientiousness, it is actually very painful to hear. But that, my personal emotions and tribulations aside, why is it okay? Why is it okay? Because if we replace Azerbaijanis, you don't have history, you don't have culture, you came from elsewhere, Coca-Cola is more ancient than your country. These are just the most harmless things that I hear on Twitter and read on Twitter. If we replace Azerbaijanis with any other ethnic or racial or religious group, Jews, Hindus, Russians, Orthodox, whatever, this is pure and unadulterated racism. Why is it okay to spew that against Azerbaijanis, but would not be okay to spew that against anyone else? What do you think?
Well, I'm assuming that the reason is because it's been done by Christians against Muslims. I mean, that's the only reason I could think of, and also because Azerbaijan doesn't have a large diaspora, it can't defend itself, and the Armenian minorities in United States and France are very well established. I mean, they have a lot of journalists, they have a lot of academics, they're networked into the political parties, and they can spread their biased, I think, viewpoint on these questions. I mean, it's a similar comparison, by the way, to Ukraine, Russia, because the Armenians always adopt the Iranian position that the Azerbaijanis are just a fake country, they're a fake people. So the Iranian viewpoint of Azerbaijan, that it's really just a fake place, it should be really part of Iran, together with southern Azerbaijan, which is inside Iran, is exactly the same view that Russia has towards Ukraine. And I've actually written about the similar comparison, that Russia denies the existence of Ukraine, Iran denies the existence of Azerbaijan, and gets very angry at the fact that Azerbaijan is now closely aligned with both Israel and Turkey, in the same way as Russia gets very angry that Ukraine's trying to align itself with the West. But it's the same thing. Here, where that becomes strange is, why is Armenia adopting the Iranian position? And even to the extent that in those formerly occupied areas, some of the Azerbaijani cultural and religious buildings were reclassified by Armenia as Iranian, as Persian, to deny Azerbaijan its identity. So it is a rather strange and bizarre question. It's not unique to Armenia, but it's I sense the frustration of Azerbaijan on this, because, believe you me, it's been frustrating for Ukrainians to explain to people in the West that no, we're not Russians, we're separate, we're different as well.
I can only imagine and share the frustration of Ukrainians in that regard. Is that okay for me to ask? Are you of Ukrainian origin?
Well,
Taras?
I was born in Britain, but my father is Ukrainian. My
Your
mother's
father.
Italian, my father's Ukrainian.
Your father is Ukrainian. So, in order to to place us on the scheme of things, as to, I truly hope that neither you nor I hold positions because of our ethnic origin, but simply because we have conscience, and we observe the situation. At least I can say that about myself, and I truly believe that to be true about you. Taras, it's easy to blame everything on the diaspora, and I think Azerbaijan is doing that quite a bit. But is there anything you think that Azerbaijan is doing wrong in presenting its side of the story? Any sort of fallacy, any cultural or let's say contextual misunderstanding or misperception that Azerbaijan is laboring under? Are there things that should be done differently when addressing the Western audiences? Is our side of the story, by our I mean Azerbaijani, is that too cumbersome for people to understand? Is it too contradictory?
Well, I don't think most people in the West know anything about Azerbaijan. I think they know very little. I mean, believe you me, until this invasion of Ukraine, they knew very little about Ukraine, which is part of Europe. So I don't think they know that much about Azerbaijan. They wrongly probably perceive it as some kind of extension of Turkey or Turkic speaking, and not really a separate country. I think there are two probably factors that are key for Azerbaijan to do, and that is to insist that within the former Soviet Union there were 15 republics. 13 of those republics have accepted that the former Soviet Republican boundaries should become the international frontiers of those states.
Mm-hmm.
Two countries have not, Russia and Armenia. And that is the crux of the problem. If Armenia accepted that simple conclusion, our boundaries in the Soviet Union are now our international frontiers, then there would be a peace agreement between both countries. Both countries would move forward. I think Azerbaijan probably needs to put greater meat on the bones about the question of minority rights in Karabakh. Although we're not talking about a huge number of people, we're talking about something 40 to 50,000 people. It's not a
The official number is 120,000. Do you
course,
believe that number to be true?
I mean, that apparently is not true, because quite a few people left after the defeat of Armenia in the Second Karabakh War. So, but irrespective of the number, that's probably a very touchy point. But I don't think beyond that Azerbaijan can do more. What's in Azerbaijan's favor, as I've said, is the fact that it should now keep telling the West, don't be hypocritical on these conflicts. If you are demanding these areas of dealing with war crimes, paying for the rebuilding of destroyed buildings in Ukraine, then you should be doing the same in the case of Armenia's occupation of Azerbaijan. So I think that works in its favor. Beyond that, I think pretty much it's going relatively well, I think. I mean, the one area which nobody really wants to highlight, which is certainly in Azerbaijan's favor, is that this is probably the only Muslim country in the world which has the closest relationship to Israel.
Taras, and Israel is currently in Europe, for reasons only Europeans would understand. Israel has become a lightning rod again over certain political issues that I don't want to delve into, because it'll be another 2 hour long conversation. Although that's very interesting and I think pertinent for our region as well. But let me ask you this: you twice already mentioned Western hypocrisy. I personally didn't go that far, but to me, it's interesting. Let me show you the tweets and replies. This is Michael Carpenter, U.S. Ambassador to the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, whom I've personally met in Warsaw in October of last year. And, honestly, it's hard for me to accuse these people of hypocrisy or not being decent or open or honest enough, because once you meet people, you sort of get a feel of who they are. The first impression is always, and I've met quite a few U.S. diplomats actually, and I've interviewed quite a few of them, and each of them emanated this sense of being decent and open and honest and good, which for me is again a question that I'm trying to pose to you. hypocrisy is made by hypocrites, but it's hard when it's hard to pinpoint somebody and say, oh, there is a hypocrite. Do you think the Ambassador Carpenter, for instance, or Ambassador Samantha Power, do you think these two tweets that I'm showing, and I'm pretty sure you're familiar with them, if you're not, I can read them to you, do you think they operate on the information that is not right? And if so, you said there are no American diplomats in that area, no U.S. diplomats.
I didn't see. No.
Oh, you did not see them. Um, have you seen foreign media, media from the West, France, the United States, other than Turkey?
A few. We saw those two Turkish CNN, and I think some from Spain and France. Yes, but I think I don't think it's that unusual to have people who think they are being objective, and at the same time they are revealing their personal biases. I think that's relatively common. It's commonly found this question. The United States has shown a bias towards Armenia since the first Karabakh War of the early 1990s, and that was always the case. The United States imposed sanctions against Azerbaijan, even though it was Azerbaijani territory that was occupied, not Armenian. So I don't think, I think diplomats like the two you mentioned do not do this consciously. That they're not being hypocrites consciously, but they have ingrained biases, possibly because of the Christian-Muslim question, possibly because of their not good relations with Turkey. This leads to them not adopting I would say, balanced viewpoint.
They're not here to defend themselves, but although we would really welcome both Ambassador Carpenter and Ambassador Power in our program, if they find time for us, and we'll reach out to them so they could talk about this. Taras, I'm very curious. We're dancing around this issue that I would also want to ask you directly about. Is it unfashionable in the Western academia or the Western media to sort of say Azerbaijan has a point? Is it not cool, whatever we mean by cool? Is it démodé, or is it, not appropriate now in, this context because of what we hear from the diasporas, what we hear from outside actors, the constant bombardment with one-sided information? Has it become difficult or maybe impossible to defend Azerbaijan's logic and position in all this?
Yes, I think it has. I know this by the fact that it's not easy to get published on these questions, and people do respond back. Are you sure about this? Is this really true? People are suspicious.
What are they suspicious of, Taras? I'm just curious. Can you give us examples?
Like things that you've been accused of, that they're suspicious that maybe, he's been funded by the Azerbaijani government, or maybe he's just biased against Armenia for various reasons.
You have no ties to the Azerbaijani government.
No, I don't have any ties. But I think it's a mixture of these things, but it certainly is more difficult. You have to tread carefully, and you have to explain your case and say, look, look at these citations. These are true. I'm not making this stuff up. But people are shocked and surprised. So, by the way, going back to your earlier question, I think Azerbaijan should spend more time explaining the crimes that were committed in the early 90s. I know that they have raised the question of destruction of the properties and religious and cultural institutions, but I don't think many people in the West know to what degree who did what in that first war, and that's my my experience. People are really surprised to hear, well, and they shouldn't be, because Armenians won that war, and they were in the commanding position. Azerbaijan was then a weak state with a very weak army. Armenia then in the early 90s was helped by the Russian army, by the Soviet and then the Russian army, and that's why it won. And that winning army committed terrible atrocities, but nobody really knows about this, and it's kind of a subject that nobody really wants to talk about. But I think so that should be raised. When I have tried to do that, I've been surprised at people going, "What? Are you serious? Really?" And how do you? There's only one way for me to explain that, and that is bias in terms of Christian versus Islamic questions, and also probably the 1915 bogeyman. That is always going to come up because there's an assumption that Azerbaijan is just continuing what Turkey previously did.
For me, again, somebody who has met some of the U.S. diplomats we're talking about here, it is very difficult. It's a big leap to, think they're biased on a religious level, that religion comes into play.
Of course, and they would never admit it.
Okay, I cannot make windows into people's souls, but what I can do is this. May I ask you, was it difficult for you to find yourself on smack in the middle of Lachin Road, covering or looking at the protest? Because from what I understand, Azerbaijani government is very careful as to whom they let in. For instance, if I ask the government to allow me to go to Lachin Road, I'm not really sure what's going to happen. I mean, I'm not sure what's going to happen if I fly to Baku to begin with. But being on Lachin Road, I'm not at all certain of the outcome. Was it difficult for you to get access? Who did you approach, and how did that work?
No, I approached some people in Britain who had contacts to a think tank in Baku, government-run think tank, and they provided the ability for me to go. I didn't sense that there was a kind of a blockade as to who was allowed to go there and who was not. I mean, you can walk around there without anybody following you as a minder, and sort of controlling what questions you asked. The only thing which I was warned not to do, which I wanted to do, was to show some anti-Russian things on my T-shirt, and they said, "You better not do that. Let's not cause any trouble with the Russian peacekeepers."
Not antagonize people with the guns. But I'm kind of curious. Did you have to pay for the trip? Did that idea emanate from you, or were you invited to participate?
No, I paid for the trip and combined it with some other research I was doing. So I mean, I'm interested in this not from the viewpoint of an anti-Armenian ethnic campaign, but from the viewpoint of geopolitics. I mean, I've written about how Armenia is helping Russia and Iran on evading sanctions, on helping Iran to supply military equipment to Ukraine. So I'm interested in this purely from the geopolitical, not from a ethno-cultural angle. Ukrainians don't have an ethno-cultural hostility to Armenians, but they do not like what Armenia has become as a geopolitical pawn of Russia's, and this has been clearly seen at the United Nations, where Armenia has always voted with Russia on the Crimean question, because it's compared Crimea's self-determination to Karabakh's self-determination, and all of these. So for me, it's geopolitics. It's all about.
I would agree with you that the Ukraine crystallized the way we look at that part of the world, the way people express support for some separatist movements, but not others.
Yes.
Where do you think on that continuum is Azerbaijan's position? I'm asking you as a Westerner. Is Azerbaijan's position to you? Is it logical? Is it impartial? Is it on the right side of the history, as you think, or is it not?
Well, it's completely under international law. Azerbaijan is completely right. The um, the former Soviet internal boundaries between the 15 republics became international borders on the 1st of January 1992, when the USSR ceased to exist. And 13 of the 15 republics agreed to that, including Ukraine. Two republics, Russia and Armenia, did not. So we have two of the 15 republics are revanchist republics. They want to change the territorial configuration of their neighbors. And so Azerbaijan is completely on the right side of international law of history. Karabakh is, under international law, part of Azerbaijan, as were the 7 occupied provinces, which have been liberated in the Second Karabakh War. So I don't think that's really the question, but there does seem to be a problem for Azerbaijan in being able to convince people that that is the case. Surprising, however, that may seem, because Armenians or Armenian lobby or Armenian minorities in the West continue to promote the question not as a question of the territorial integrity of states. They don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about how, if Karabakh remains part of Azerbaijan, there'll be ethnic cleansing, there'll be genocide, etc., etc., which is obviously a strange paradox for Armenians to argue when they did the most crimes in the early 1990s. It is a rather strange area of discussion and argumentation. Azerbaijan wants to focus on territorial integrity of states. Armenia wants to focus on national minority rights and the threat of genocide. And one is more fiction, one is more, based on international law.
One last question. I understand I've taken a lot of your time today, but as a Westerner, as a British citizen, do you feel you have any concerns over the well-being and safety of the ethnic Armenian minority inside Azerbaijan? Those who live in Karabakh. Do you think that Azerbaijan will treat them right? Do you think that when they talk about their unease, do you commiserate with them?
Not really, no, because I think they are living in the past, as it were, living in the times of both 1915 and the First Karabakh War. I really don't see how, in the contemporary era, 21st century, it is not in the interests of Azerbaijan to commit some crimes there, some killings or some ethnic cleansing. It's simply not in Azerbaijan's interest. Azerbaijan wants to be recognized as a partner of the European Union on energy questions. Wants to be recognized as an ally of Turkey and Israel. To do anything stupid like that and criminal like that would work against that, and it would be not something I don't think that Baku would do. Just look at how the war was prosecuted in the Second Karabakh War. There were very few cases of abuse of war crimes. In fact, the one or two occasions when missiles were fired at civilian areas were fired by Armenia at Azerbaijan, and not the other way around. So what we have, and again, if you compare this to Ukraine, it's similar. The Azerbaijani and Ukrainian armies are both NATO-trained armies. And that NATO training instills discipline, it instills respect for human rights, it instills some kind of command and order. Those kind of things didn't exist in the First Karabakh War. It was chaos, it was, anarchy. That's not the case anymore. And so the manner in which the Azerbaijani army prosecuted the Second Karabakh War, it prosecuted that in a professional manner. There were always going to be one or two bad apples, right? That inevitably happens with every military force, including the American. Right. But on the whole, Azerbaijani army was very professional and very, 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 good in the way it treated Armenian prisoners of war and the way it treated civilians. So I think those times from the early 90s, late 80s are gone. This is a different era. And yes, of course, the minority in Karabakh should be given some kind of internationally guaranteed minority rights. But that has to be as part of a package whereby Armenia and Azerbaijan sit at the table, sign a peace treaty, put their history away and move forward. And that way, Armenia can develop as a country as well. It can get rid of its alliance with Iran, doesn't need that alliance, doesn't give Armenia anything. Instead, it can have good, peaceful relations with both Turkey and Azerbaijan and move to have more of a, shall we say, a multi-vector foreign policy, which allows it to also develop relations with the European Union, which was stopped in 2013 by Russia.
Taras, thank you very much for the most thought-provoking discussion, and I truly hope you and I meet again on the air again sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, not much for me to say. This was, first of all, again, I apologize for the mishap in the beginning there. We have moved to a new studio, and not everything works the way it is supposed to, and we're trying to find all those little bugs and fix them, but sometimes they get, they get out. This was Taras Kuzio, my guest, a professor of political science, National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. He is an expert on politics, crime, and security in Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. I have found my guest on Twitter. I've seen some of his tweets. And speaking of tweets, today we discussed some of the American diplomats here. Michael Carpenter, the U.S. ambassador to the OSCE, and a former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Sorry there. I was trying to show you the tweets that we talked about. And I would love to invite both of them on our program. I will reach out to them, although I do think that I know the outcome. For a channel this small, it is very hard to get the attention of high-ranking U.S. diplomats, unfortunately. We do have some reach in the region, and we do have some audience in the region who is very important for, for the U.S. foreign policy officials to reach out to, I think. In any case, I'm not going to editorialize or summarize what my guest has said. All of those of you who have joined us in the middle of the program can go back and watch it in recording. Please do like and share our content if you see it fit, if you see it up to your standard, up to what you expect, because it truly helps our channel, small channel, grow. Our English language broadcasting is not very common, but we're trying to increase that and change that, because we believe that more unbiased and balanced information has to come out of the region, and it's hard for us to compete with all the other resources that repeat propaganda. We do not repeat propaganda insofar as we do not knowingly tell you lies on this channel. If we say something that turns out to be not true, we come back and apologize for it, and we retract this information. If we're misleading you inadvertently, it means we were misled. So I want you to keep that in mind. We don't have an agenda. As an American citizen, I treat everything, every event, every happening in the world with a sense of fairness. Basic human fairness is what you can expect of me, because this is what I expect of every person I am interacting with. Be it Armenian, be it Azerbaijani, be it anyone else, all I want is basic human fairness and maybe kindness, if that's not too much to ask for. Speaking of kindness, in the face of the earthquake in Turkey, I would like to express my condolences to the people of Turkey, to the people of Syria. I know that the tremors were felt in Lebanon. I've spoken to my friends in Israel. They have felt the most enormous tremor in the middle of the night there, as the earthquake with the epicenter in Gaziantep in Turkey took place. Took place. My friends in Cyprus say the same thing. In other words, this is a tragedy for the region. I am very grateful for ethnic Armenians, even to Ruben Vardanyan, who is the states minister, from what I believe, quote unquote, of the unrecognized republic there. He expressed his condolences to the families of the victims and to the victims themselves. And I do appreciate that very much. I really, truly do. I look you in the eye when I say that, and I don't know what else to do so you would believe my sincerity. However, in these emotional times, and an earthquake in Turkey, I see as an earthquake, in Azerbaijan. It's the same thing for me. There or here, a disaster does not matter, really. To me. You may disagree with me. Seeing even a few insensitive, intentionally incendiary comments on Twitter or other social media where I'm present, it is painful, and it derails, it changes the entire atmosphere, it changes the entire mindset. I don't want to ascribe the feeling of hate, the emotion, the sentiment to the entire people. That would be wrong. I do believe that hating people because of their national or ethnic or religious origin is barbarian, is barbaric. I do not see that as compatible with civilized behavior and what we expect of a civilized person in this day and age. I've said that many times in Russian when I directly spoke to the Armenian audience that we have, and I'll say it again in English for the first time, because I do truly hope that we have some English-speaking Armenians watching us. God knows we've invited some of them on our program before. When three are in the boat, in a tiny boat, and the boat is sinking, and there is a Titanic next to you that is about to sink and create a huge wormhole, is that what you call it? Probably. In other words, when there is this monster next to you, whose behavior is very unpredictable, who is not on your side, neither on the side of Georgia, nor Armenia, nor Azerbaijan, Russia has never been a friend to anyone, especially to these three countries. Look at our history. Tell me I am wrong. Show me a moment when Russia came through for either you Armenians or us Azerbaijanis or Georgians. I don't think I'll have to wait, I'll have to wait for a while for you to come up with that. Only rowing away from danger, all three of us, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, can hope to preserve their sovereignty and liberty and survive. This is my sincere hope and emotion. And I apologize that I am sharing my personal views here. I don't do that often, but hearing that I'm a Leni Riefenstahl to Aliyev regime is quite annoying. I apologize. We're all human. Journalists pretending they're not human and they're robots and they don't have a personal opinion, that's hypocrisy. That's a lie. We always do. And I will be one of them, journalists, sharing those views with you, okay? hoping that Russia will come in and mediate between two of its, provinces, as the West may see it, some in the West, delegating this whole area to Russia as Russia's backyard. It's offensive, it's naive, and it's very myopic. Russia has not intended to create peace in our region, and it'll never do so, because that, as my guest today said, as numerous, countless guests before him have said, Russia's only goal is to keep its foothold in South Caucasus. How can it achieve doing so? By seeking Armenia and Azerbaijan against each other, by creating constant conflict, war, by making sure one attacks the other, by making sure that Russia is needed in that region. If we achieve peace, Azerbaijan and Armenia, Russia will do its damnedest to derail that peace, just to not be kicked out of Armenia and not to be kicked out of Azerbaijan. Because look at this, look at the world through the Russian eyes. If Armenia has its guarantees of security, be it from Turkey, be it from Azerbaijan, be it from elsewhere, Russian army bases are no longer needed. What does it mean? It means Armenia gets out of Russia's orbit and maybe, hopefully, gravitates towards Europe, together with Azerbaijan. That would be my hope. Well, Georgia could do it. It's halfway there, but it's on that path. Why are we embroiled in this conflict, and why are we trying to kill each other? I believe it is becoming a consensus in the Armenian society, as it is a consensus in the Azerbaijani society, that neither Azerbaijan nor Armenia are winning this war. Russia is winning this war. It will always be winning this war, because the cards, as we say in, I believe in Russian or Azerbaijani, the cards are marked. We're not on the even playing field. The game is fixed from the very beginning. From the very beginning, every move Armenia and Azerbaijan make, they lose and Russia wins. I don't know how else to say it more plainly. And I hope this helps explain to some of my detractors here, to whom I've learned not to pay attention, but sometimes you want to address people's concerns, because some people are genuine in their mistrust, and these are the people I want to talk to. I hope this outlines my worldview. I do not hate you because you're Armenian, because A, I'm incapable of hating people because of their ethnic origin. That would be not what I consider humane and civilized. That's for one. For another, I see Armenia as an instrument of Russia's foreign policy. Armenia, if anything, deserves my commiseration for putting itself in such a situation from which I personally don't see a way out. Unless your entire society mobilizes, tries to preserve its security. Think about it. After the 2020 war, and I've covered the war, I've talked to people on both sides of the conflict immediately after the war, there were serious conversations inside Armenia questioning whether it is okay to sacrifice Armenia's sovereignty for guarantee of security from Russia. I will say that's what Russia wants. And after you, it'll want Azerbaijan, and after Azerbaijan, it'll want Georgia. Maybe not in that particular order, but in some order. That is the goal. To give you something, some promises which are usually not delivered upon, may I say, in return for the ephemeral safety or security or stability that they offer or purport to offer. Let's look at Ukraine. I know Ukrainians are not going to like me for this, but, from our perception, Russians and Ukrainians speak a similar language, share a similar culture, not the same, but somewhat parallels can be drawn. Okay, I don't want to offend Ukrainians. I understand your sentiment. I would feel the same if somebody compared me to Russians and tried to, Russia and tried to, make a pronouncement. But again, let's look at the war between Russia and Ukraine through the eyes of Armenians and Azerbaijanis, okay? Just for 1 second. These two countries that those people in my generation, will understand what I mean, we've come to regard as, the foundation for the Soviet Union. The friendship between Armenians and between Russians and Ukrainians has always been made an example for the rest of us to follow, the rest of Soviets. You see the sacred, inviolable, whatever, epithets or, adjectives they used. And what happened to that friendship? Russia is bombing Kyiv, okay, and the rest of Ukraine, Kharkiv. To me, as a Soviet person, it's unimaginable. It's mind-blowing in the true sense of the word. How can Russia be fighting Ukraine? How is that possible? Ukrainians sending their women and children to Germany to save them from Russians? Has the world gone mad? But this is a reality we're dealing with. So let me ask Armenians this. If Russians can do this to Ukraine, do you or do we really think that we're more important to Russians? We're more dear to Russians' hearts. We're closer to Russians than Ukraine once was. If they can do that to them, what makes us think they're not gonna do that to us? A. And B, they have our interest at heart. Large nations, large powers, such as Russia, really don't care about others. Not often do they care about others or fairness or this or the other. They care about their own interest. And when it comes to their interest, I already told you what I think. We have to think, Armenians, you love your history. You talk about it all the time. Whether prompted or unprompted, forgive me. Azerbaijanis try to keep up, and we started talking about our ancient history. I personally think it's wrong because the conflict is today. Who cares who owned what, when, and how? Okay? What happened 2,000 years ago has very little to no influence on what's happening today. And who lived where? Let's leave that to historians. It's great. The Romans founded London. You don't see Italy claiming London just because the Roman Empire founded it, Londinium. Okay? You see my argument there. But what I'm trying to say is, we both like to think and tout our ancient history, our wisdom that should come with millennia-old statehood, okay, in the case of Armenia. So let's look at what we're doing with this wisdom these days, ladies and gentlemen. We are letting Russians manipulate us into killing each other. Where is all that Totik is writing? Russia came through for Armenia in 1990s. I believe you're writing from Armenia, or you're ethnic Armenian, because I've seen you on this channel before. What happened? Well, how did you pay for Russians coming through for you in the 1990s? They did not come through for you. Your interests and Russia's interests aligned in keeping Azerbaijan from becoming European, gravitating towards Europe or towards Turkey or both. Because in the 90s it was the same. The direction was the same. How did you pay for this in the 1990s? And how did you pay for this in 2020? That is a question I want to leave you face to face with. As I say goodbye from Washington, I'm Ismail Jalilov. I truly hope to see you on other broadcasts. Have a great evening. Bye.